In this, the 19th lesson of the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we look more closely at the consequences of public policies that permit the private appropriation of the rental value of land and rents generally. The lesson is that we ignore land markets at our peril. Our journey through the evolution of economics as a distinct discipline has highlighted as a fundamental shortcoming the failure to recognize the importance of land markets as distinct from the markets for labor, for capital goods, and for credit. An important question is whether the removal of land from economic analysis occurred because economists came to the conclusion that land differed in no material respects from goods we produce, or was there a deliberate effort to influence how economics was taught by powerful vested interests? In his 1994 book, The Corruption of Economics, economist Fred Harrison made a strong accusation. He wrote, "Henry George had to be stopped. The American journalist had become a threat to the power elites throughout the world. His crime was to inflame the masses with the idea that social justice was a real possibility in this world, not just the hereafter." Harrison points to the first generation of economists as a group who served the power elites to their own advantage. He writes, "At the turn of the 20th century, economists abused their discipline by sieving off the reality of life. They turned political economy into a pseudoscience. They did so by abandoning the real world in favor of metaphysics, a device they concealed by glossing their new terminology with the comforting rigor of abstract models. Their legacy has been a discipline which, far from clarifying the real-world processes, is now used to prescribe policies that are as mystifying as the preachings of schoolmen of the Middle Ages." After Fred Harrison's introduction to the subject, Mason Gaffney, now an emeritus professor of economics from the University of California, provided the historical details of how their discipline was subjected to corrupting influence. Gaffney wrote, "Rent takers and their wordsmiths could abide the classical economics of Locke, Hume, Smith, and Ricardo, who stopped short of challenging the distribution of wealth. The menace George posed to rent takers is clear from how he viewed them. To George, the landowner per se is non-functional, unproductive, a layabout drone, a drain on the hive, a transferee, a welfare case." As Henry George's influence grew around the world in the final 2 decades of the 19th century, those who most benefited by the status quo realized he had to be opposed and his ideas systematically discredited. Mason Gaffney provides the details of just how this was accomplished, even as the collapse of speculation-driven property markets in the late 1920s set the stage for the Great Depression. He supports the view that politics dictates economic outcomes, and the politics were largely, but not exclusively, on the side of vested interests. The United States Congress had any number of opportunities to consider reforms based on Henry George's analysis of what was wrong with the American system. Henry George's own son was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1910, but served only 2 terms before suffering health problems. At least one member of the House of Representatives, Charles R. Eckert of Pennsylvania, who served from 1935 to 1939, kept trying without success to change the system of taxation at the federal level. In a speech delivered 6 June 1938, Eckert made his case. He stated, Henry George traces the primary cause of business depressions to its very roots. It is clear that neither presidents nor political parties are responsible for business depressions, excepting to the extent that they fail to remove the causes. While it is unfair to place the responsibility of the 1929 collapse upon President Hoover, it is equally unfair to place upon President Roosevelt the responsibility of the present recession. The so-called Hoover Depression is still on. It has not yet run its course. This is quite clear when we view depressions in retrospect. The present recession is simply a relapse of the 1929 collapse due to the fact that the underlying causes of the so-called Hoover Depression have not yet been removed or corrected. That task still lies ahead. While others argued over monetary policy, regulation of industry and finance, unions and deficits, economists and others who had not forgotten the teachings of Henry George did their best to reintroduce the land question into the public dialogue. Many were in some way associated with the one group devoted to these positions, the International Union for Land Value Taxation, based in London, England. Henry George's words reminded them of work yet to be accomplished. We did not abolish slavery with the 14th Amendment. To abolish slavery, we must abolish exclusive ownership of land. Unless we acknowledge the equal right of all to land, our free institutions will be in vain, and all our discoveries and inventions will only add to the force that presses the masses down. Yet the campaign to purge economics of any serious consideration of what political economists had called the land question had a deep effect on what was written and taught, even by those professors who agreed with much of what Henry George had to say. Even Harry Gunnison Brown, who more than any of his contemporaries embraced Henry George's principles, viewed decisions regarding monetary policy as the primary cause of economic depressions. Brown wrote, "The truth probably is that central banking policy has more to do than anything else with the alternation of prosperity and depression. Unduly sharp and persistent bank credit restriction can quickly turn prosperity into depression." Yet in a later paper, Brown offered a very Henry George-like answer to what Keynesians identify as a key trigger for recession becoming depression. Brown stated, "Both Hansen and Keynes emphasize as an important causative factor in the initiating of depression a general unwillingness to invest. If, therefore, we were to untax capital and draw sufficient additional revenue to make up the loss by heavier taxes on the geologically produced and community-produced value of land, this would certainly provide a greater reward to those who save and invest in capital." In 1933, economist Homer Hoyt produced a remarkable study of land market cycles in Chicago, covering the previous century. Curiously, he then backpedaled on his own findings. He wrote, "The sequence of events just described may in the future be of interest only to historians, and the knowledge of the mode of behavior of forces in the real estate cycle will have no value in forecasting the trend of future events." Why Hoyt failed to acknowledge and argue for the universal implications of his research is unclear. The historical record of other cities in the United States and other countries reveals a remarkable cyclical consistency. In 1951, another analyst, Roy Folk, a vice president at Dun & Bradstreet, tried in vain to draw the attention of economists to the role land markets played in driving the business cycle. Folk wrote, "Naturally, there can be no production without labor. Likewise, there can be no production without land. That is self-evident in agriculture, cattle raising, forestry, and the mining of natural resources. But it also holds just as true in commerce, industry, transportation, banking, insurance, and other service activities. For all business activity requires land, a place, a spot, a site, a location, so many acres or square feet of the Earth's surface on which to operate. Those who champion Henry George's analysis face the challenge of proving that the size of the nation's rent fund was huge and therefore could pay for a large portion of needed public goods and services. A study undertaken in 1961 attempted to answer this challenge, first raising the crucial questions of theory. Is land a unique factor of production whose supply is inelastic? Has the share of land rent in national income increased over time? Would a confiscatory tax on land rent yield sufficient revenues to make all other taxes unnecessary? The findings of this study suggested economists had failed to do the one thing the profession called for: gather and report on the statistics. While rich in detail, the data on which this analysis is based leave much to be desired. The information on land values is far inferior to that relating to structures. Little is yet known about the acreage of taxable and tax-exempt lands. There is still no body of adequate data relating to the value of public utility and tax-exempt property by states. What is also true is that the pursuit of personal wealth by speculation in land, always present, has become a cultural norm long before the 1960s. Harper's Magazine reported on the latest land boom in 1968. Unimproved land is distinct from other private property. It has not been created by any of its owners. Moreover, its value is often enhanced by what others who do not own it do to it. As John Stuart Mill once remarked, landlords grow rich in their sleep. What he meant, of course, was precisely what we have seen, that the increase in population automatically makes land more valuable. Thus, the distinction between a successful and an unsuccessful land speculator often has more to do with the ability to interpret and predict the movement of population than with sagacity about how to improve the land itself. Successful land speculators also often have close ties to those in government involved in land use decisions, such as where highways are to be extended and where interchanges will be located. Selection of the site for a new airport is also a process that quietly generates intense land speculation by those who know before the general public. And so we've reached the end of Lesson 19.